Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are around the world. This is Scott Dill and the rest of the Real Story Group team here for today's webinar on CDPs in your stack. We'll take a look at some alternative architectural patterns for you to explore. And this is certainly a topic that we're very excited about. We've seen such great enthusiasm from our customers about customer data platforms. And so we're excited to have both Tony Byrne and Apoorv Durga on the line with us today that are going to take us through the heart of today's presentation. As we get started, I just wanted to touch on a couple of quick housekeeping items of note as we're going through today's session. So first, there is a questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. So if we have some time at the end, we can get to your questions or hear your feedback. And if we, for some reason, don't get to you, we'll certainly reach out after today's session. For all of those that are attending today, you will be able to get a copy of the slides. And then I do see a number of our customers on the line. So for those of you folks that subscribe to our research, you will be able to access a recording of today's session. Again, this is a topic that's certainly very exciting to us. We've been publishing research on customer data platforms for about 3 years and following that market for even longer than that. And one thing to think about when you're looking at Real Story Group as opposed to other analyst firms is we never work for or advise the vendors that we cover in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so we don't say here's the best CDP vendor, here's the worst, but rather what's going to be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do and what problems are you looking to solve. So that's the way that we evaluate each of these solutions. And with us, you're getting a much more hard-hitting approach when detailing what their vendors do well, but also where they could potentially fall short for you. So, we'll look at some of the engagement models that we offer a little bit later in today's session. But I just wanted you to keep that in the back of your mind as we're going through the session. And of course, the customer data platform research, that's one of the 8 areas that we offer as part of our coverage that you see here on the MarTech stack vendor map. It's the orange line that you see and the vendors that we cover in that space. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony and Apoorv to take us through the heart of today's session. Gentlemen.
Great, thanks, Scott. I'll set the table up and then Apoorv is going to serve up some tasty dishes from there. So this is our MarTech stack vendor map. Many, if not most of you have seen this already. These are all the different vendors we evaluate across the different marketplaces, which we call streams here. And the orange line, of course, a big line right in the middle with major players and a number of pure play vendors. I include this map here, though, today to suggest that CDP has to coexist, maybe even more than any other tool, as part of a larger stack. And so that's going to be one of the themes today is how does the CDP coexist with your existing investments? Because different vendors make different assumptions around this, and it's a really important filter for you to think about. Fortunately, we're going to bring a framework to the party to help you kind of understand all that. So the first thing we'll do is a little bit of if I can almost say that there's a history to the CDP market. I think it's old enough now, there's a little bit of a history, and there was an original CDP model which may or may not work for you. And so we're going to kind of go beyond the sort of original concept of a CDP and what are some different models here, particularly with respect to CDPs in the kind of wider customer data ecosystem that many of you are building or have built. And then Apoorv's going to take you into the meat of the matter here, which are different reference frameworks or reference patterns that you can use to sort of understand, okay, where does a CDP fit in my environment? And then we'll wrap up, of course, with marketplace and selection implications, always top of mind for us here at Real Story Group. So let's look at the traditional model for CDPs, and this was how many CDP vendors started out. Going back really to the middle of the last decade, where you had the CDP as kind of the center of your customer data universe, and it would ingest a lot of raw data first and zero-party data, second and third-party data, process that data, and then provide segments, and then push those segments and data out to different engagement channels and advertising, and then also supply analytic services. And so this was, CDP almost providing a customer data ecosystem in a box here, and many vendors sort of started out this way, which it turned out to be a fairly kind of expansive set of services. And what has become more evident as we try to, think about customer data platforms in a more mature environment, we've already made other data management investments, is that, we're thinking about, okay, customer data management versus customer data activation. And then in the lower right, enterprise analytics, that, maybe from a services perspective, these are three different domains. Now, from a product perspective, you may want to bundle all these together, and this is going to be among your choices that Apoorv is going to describe. But from a services perspective, which is the way you always want to look at this, these are potentially three different domains. And so you want to think about what investments have you already made, and how would any new investments in customer data technology then impact your existing environment. So I'm not going to go through this slide in great detail because we've got a lot of ground to cover, but this is just an example of if we were going to break this up into greater detail, and this is what we do when we're sort of engaging with our subscribers and clients, is we start looking at this, from a more detailed perspective. What are the different data services that fall under the right, under core data management, the top right, and then in the top left, and then in the lower left, what are the key services that fall under data activation? And so you've got some core customer data services at the top, from ingest, normalize, enrich, report, and then in activation, obviously creating audiences and segments, potentially applying rules and triggers, deploying to multiple channels, generating some reports, and then potentially in the purple, getting into some actual marketing activities. So this is a universe of services. The interesting thing about most of you is that you already have some capabilities that are performing these somewhere in your stack. And so the question is, how does my CDP fit into this environment? Do I need all of this? Do I need just some of this? Maybe you don't need any of this. You have this all covered, in which case maybe you don't need a CDP at all. And we've definitely had use cases for that. So if we think about that, then how does the CDP fit, within this broader customer data ecosystem? And so let's jump into that. I'll remind you once again that if you have any questions or comments, things you agree with or disagree with, any anecdotes you want to share, feel free to use the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll have time to get to that. So many of you have seen this. This is our latest MarTech services reference model. We call this the reference model for the omni-channel stack, or the reference model for the 2020s, because this is very forward-looking, where we think the next decade is going to be taking us, where yes, at the top you have various engagement channels and interaction and delivery environments, content and engagement services, where many of you have made significant investments and vendor relationships. But then the most interesting part, where we think a lot of the energy is going to go to in the future, is really lower in your stack, around enterprise foundation services. And those fall into multiple different cones here, including content on the left, data in the middle, and then decisioning over on the right. Data, once again, we break up into kind of three different boxes here. There's customer data activation in orange, customer data management in a sort of sky Carolina blue, and then in dark blue below that, data intelligence, analytics, reporting, and so forth. So these are clusters of services that make up your enterprise foundation services. And the key to enterprise foundation services, of course, is that they're decoupled from your content and engagement services and your engagement channels, so that you can apply those services, those enterprise services, across multiple channels and essentially de-silo your environment. So that's really the power of what you see below the bottom black box here. Now, if we look at that, then we see that CDPs have to fit within a broader stack. So I'll introduce a kind of generic reference framework for this from a customer data perspective, and then Apoorv is going to dive into some specific design patterns for you to think about. So this is the generic model here, and there's a lot going on here, so I'll just linger a little bit on this slide. This is an enterprise service model for customer data. And it falls into two sort of broad buckets here. One is in the black box here on the left is the customer data ecosystem, and then on the right in purple is customer engagement. Right? And so I think we can understand we've got a customer data ecosystem on the left, and then customer engagement on the right. But when we think about the customer data ecosystem, that in itself, for many organizations, particularly larger organizations, falls into some logical service buckets that you really want to think about here. So the first is what we describe as an enterprise data fabric. So that's this gray box here, and it's typically managed by IT and data operations. So this is some core customer activity. So you've got core data services in dark blue: ingestion, cleaning, aggregating, processing, analytics, modeling, and predictions. These are things that your data science and data management and data ops team are going to be doing for all of you, potentially most or all of the data within your enterprise, not just your customer data. But then we see the rise of what we would call a customer data hub. This could be a virtual hub as opposed to necessarily a physical place. But this is where you're doing some core data services against customer data. So with a kind of domain delimited space here, where the sorts of things that you want to do would be unification and identity resolution, data enrichment, stewardship, governance, compliance and consent, reporting, and then of course developing some kind of a pipeline of data into an environment where it can be activated. So you've got core data services and customer data hub managed by IT and data ops as part of your enterprise data fabric. But then you've got customer data activation. Of course, this is the exciting part because this is where you actually put that organize that data and put it into motion for your marketing and engagement purposes. So you might do some light processing. You're definitely going to be doing some segmentation, some activation, potentially some event triggering, and potentially some light modeling and analytics. So this part of the ecosystem, you're crossing a bit of a Rubicon here, because here's where, rather than IT and data ops, you've got marketing ops. Who should nominally be owning this. And of course, that is one of the prime motivators originally of CDPs, was to try to provide a space where marketing ops could actually manage this data. But it assumes that I've got this core data services and some sort of customer data hub, whether it's virtual or not, that's pushing data into an activation environment. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail in terms of systems and roles. So if we look at the enterprise data fabric, again, it's made up of core data services and a customer data hub. And so you've got on the left, data lakes and enterprise data warehouses. They're doing data processing, data integration, data science. On the right, in the customer data hub, this is more of a domain-specific data mart environment. Again, maybe it's a virtualized environment where you're doing, again, some data processing, some data analysis, and then data exports. And so the types of personas you need to manage the user interfaces here are typically revolve around IT and data ops. So you've got an integration engineer, data scientist, data steward. These are just collections of roles. You may have more roles. You may name them a little bit differently, but hopefully here you get the general idea. This is IT and data ops. As opposed to the customer data activation space, where it's really marketing ops. You're doing some data analysis, but the key thing here is you've got a business user experience or a business interface on top of it. So that's what you typically don't have in a data warehouse or a data lake. You've got data accessibility and data export, right? So, which is like data activation into an engagement environment. So this typically is going to be run by marketing ops, who certainly have to be data aware and data cognizant, but they're doing it in the context of marketing use cases, marketing or engagement use cases. So, that kind of sets the table here in terms of the overall framework that we use. But what's interesting, of course, is that as analysts, we create these nice, neat little boxes, right? And we put little services into boxes, and so that makes the world seem maybe a little bit cleaner than it really is in real life. Having said that, there's definitely some patterns here. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Apoorv, who's going to run you through 3 master patterns, and then there's a couple of variants to those. So it's a total of 5 patterns altogether about how do different CDP vendors approach the scope of this from either very broadly or very narrowly, and what does that mean for you? And when he's done, I'll come back and wrap up in terms of some of the implications. So Apoorv, we'll turn it over to you for pattern number 1, customer data ecosystem.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for setting up the model. So let's build on this model and look at what's emerging. And what is emerging is that there are several functionalities or capabilities that can be clubbed under the broad definition of CDP. But a lot of customers aren't really starting from clean slate, right? So they're saying we are already doing data ingestion and normalization as part of our data fabric. So maybe as an extension to data lake or whatever, or we would like to keep data modeling outside of CDP so that not just CDP, but other products can also use our models. Therefore, you need to be able to have an architecture where your CDP coexists with all these existing functionalities. And so you need a CDP that provides ideally what you need, not more, not less. Now, of course, that would be impossible to do because there can be infinite permutation and combinations of all these services. So based on what our customers have ended up doing, we have seen a few patterns or frameworks emerge. The first pattern is what we call the customer data ecosystem. Here your CDP really provides key services across all layers or pillars of customer data ecosystem. So there are those 3 core data services: customer data hub and customer data activation. Right. So all the services mentioned under those 3 are essentially getting tick marks from the CDP vendor. So here you really don't have a lot of going on separately with respect to data fabric. So your CDP has a play in all these 3 areas of customer data ecosystem. So right from ingesting content from zero first to second, third party sources to cleansing it up, doing all sorts of data management activities, and then creating unified profiles, and all of that followed by activation. Right. A variant of this is what we term ecosystem plus, which is the next pattern. So essentially that pattern, but a variant of that. In this pattern, you include everything in a customer data ecosystem plus some more in engagement layer, right? So perhaps some sort of personalization, or maybe email newsletter campaigns or product recommendations. So essentially you are using your CDP for core data services and data management, in addition to using it for activation and some part of engagement. Now you will notice that I should have actually mentioned this. So the key is that the capabilities in orange are really provided by the CDP in each of this pattern, right? So, and we have given some example vendors here, but obviously there are others as well. Also, just because they have functionality across the spectrum does not make them superior to others, right? Because that is why different patterns exist.
Yeah.
Now this pattern.
The other thing I just add there, Apoorv, is like, we're not declaring that they're necessarily good at all these services. In fact, both these vendors have some weaknesses here. We're just talking about, the kind of scope that they have. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And one more thing about this pattern ecosystem plus is that this pattern is really common when you are really starting from a clean slate, or you have needs that can be addressed by a single product. Right? But if you have complex needs or existing infrastructure is already there in place, this pattern or framework will introduce a lot of overlaps. The next pattern is
I think this is sometimes these tools get selected when marketing either doesn't have these capabilities or wants to just completely move aside, create a parallel ecosystem. The other thing that's interesting about Redpoint and Adobe and others that do this is they actually have multiple products doing this. It may be a single platform like Experience Platform or Redpoint Global, but because the diversity of services are here, there are different products and different interfaces that make this all up underneath the covers. At the end of the day, it is difficult to do all these things under simply one user experience because there's so many diverse personas. But anyway, that's pattern 1.
The next pattern is customer data management. So in this pattern, you have your core data services being performed by something else in your data fabric. So you might have built extensions on top of your data lake, for example, or you've built capabilities for data ingestion and cleansing and so on elsewhere. So in this pattern, your CDP usually ends up performing some tasks within the middle box, which is the customer data hub and customer data activation. So you ingest data and carry out data processing outside of CDP, and then hand off to CDP for remaining data and activation tasks. Right. So commonly used or commonly done tasks are there in Orange, but there are of course variation, and those vary from product to product. So some products could do some other combination of the, but essentially the idea of this pattern is that the core data services are outside of the CDP, and the CDP does only a subset of the customer data management activities. Then we have the last pattern, which is quite common. This sort of a pattern includes several activation-oriented CDPs. So essentially, you have a well-established working enterprise data fabric, right? So perhaps that includes a data lake, a data warehouse, advanced data modeling capabilities, and so on. So the first two services, that is the core data services and customer data hub, are outside the CDP. So they are carried by your external data fabric, or by the components external to your CDP, and then that data is handed over to CDP for activation. Now, very often such products not only do activation, meaning they orchestrate and manage campaigns across external engagement platforms, they also perform some of those capabilities themselves. So we often see some activation-oriented platforms with built-in capabilities for personalization, sometimes with recommendation, or as the next variation shows, sometimes with email capabilities, right? So the common point here is that in this pattern, they are mostly activation oriented. So all those capabilities in the third box, plus some capabilities from the engagement box, which is the extreme right. Right. So to summarize, we are seeing several patterns that are emerging. We call them ecosystem plus, data management, data activation, and variation of this. And all of these have several implications on your selection process. So like I said, you want to select the right product for your needs without overbuying or underbuying. So let's take a look at the marketplace. So Tony, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Apoorv. And I'm glad you mentioned about, a couple slides back about this mixed model where, you might see some orange over on the left. So even Blue Shift or BlueConic might argue that some of the services we have in blue over on the left, they may or may not provide. And so in the real world, it's a little messier than what we're showing here. These are generalized patterns. And so, of course, for you need to dig into the details. Obviously, we can help you do that in terms of what's included and what's not, and to really minimize the sort of overlaps that Apoorv has been warning you against. But yeah, let's look at the marketplace and selection implications. So this is a pretty traditional view of an emerging marketplace where you've got major suite vendors and then pure play platforms. A lot of shifts going on in the market, a lot of new entrants, some M&A activity, but no one, typically with rare exceptions, we don't have vendors actually exiting the market, which means that the rising tide is lifting nearly all the boats. Our research suggests that the suite vendors are still somewhat varying degrees of lagging the other pure play platforms, both in terms of the maturity of the technology and the kind of parochial nature of their platforms, which are designed really to stitch together their own stacks rather than serve as a truly independent layer. So we have some serious cautions about the suite vendors on the left if you take a look at our evaluations. But, if you recall that, and hopefully now you've seen from the way Apoorv described these patterns, is that, there's a wide scope for potential services, including, a CDP that might span 3 of these boxes here under enterprise foundation services, the 3 that we have grayed out at the bottom. And so another way to look at the market is sort of where does this vendor fit? So this is a very generalized view. I wouldn't make a short list off of this because I'm not going to suggest that this is necessarily scientific. This is more just our sort of impressions of where we see the vendors in terms of the types of capabilities they provide against those 3 boxes, which is activation versus management versus analytics. And so, but this can kind of help you understand that there are these 3 cones here. there's no magic vendor in the middle, and I would argue there probably never will be. And so this is another way of thinking about where you might fit in this world. You do need to be careful, of course, that other vendors may try to sell you a CDP that's bound to their particular platform. This is something you need to be very careful about because ideally you want the CDP to be an independent enterprise foundation service and not something you buy with your CRM or with your ESP or with your web content management system and so on and so forth. I wrote a piece about that in martech.org you can check out, but this is always the caveat we give. If you need a CDP, go license a CDP and not something that's bolted on and called a CDP. But the one thing that we believe very strongly in at Real Story Group, regardless of marketing technology, is that you ought to use a business use case approach to understanding your needs, generating shortlists, and ultimately creating test cases for how you will evaluate vendors. And so when we evaluate CDP vendors, yes, we look at the architectures and the design patterns that Apoorv mentioned, but also, more importantly, how do they fit against what it is you're actually trying to do with this technology? So this is a business-focused approach to filtering these vendors. Of course, not all vendors are going to support all the different use cases. Our research suggests that the typical CDP vendor is only good at 3 or 4 of these things, and then maybe kind of covers a couple others. So this ought to be driving, your focus in terms of doing this. For those of you that are Real Story Group subscribers, you can use our Real Quadrant application to generate your own shortlist. Here's one where we are generating a shortlist based on 3 different use cases for CDP: outbound marketing campaign support, offline and online aggregation, and digital advertising support. And that generates a quadrant that looks like this. Now, if we logged in, you'd get the actual vendor names there. You can go try this out yourself if you're interested. But the point is that you really want to use business scenarios. Perhaps use architecture as an initial filter, but then use business scenarios to create the true shortlist and to create the test cases against which you'll evaluate the vendors the same way that we do. So here's the final takeaways. Hopefully you've heard all of these already, but we'll reiterate them. I think first is to clarify, where a CDP lives within your customer data ecosystem, and for that matter, do you really need one? You'll definitely need different capabilities and skill sets across that ecosystem, even if you try to subsume a number of those services under one product. So that's important to know. Take care not to unduly duplicate capabilities you already have. So that was really one of Apoorv's strongest messages, that if you already have certain data management capabilities and you have access to those capabilities, you really want to avoid sort of duplicating that. But at the same time, vendors don't follow these clean boundaries that we make for them. So you want to test each vendor very carefully against what they say they can do. And also, the reality is that a vendor may provide a service, but they may not do it particularly well. So just a vendor having a capability doesn't mean it's the right capability for you. The good news is CDP remains a highly fragmented marketplace, likely to begin to be that way for a while. So you've got many viable choices. And when you're making those choices, yes, use architecture as a filter, but business scenarios as your prime kind of evaluation criteria. So I'm going to turn over to Scott here for a second and wanted to remind you that you can ask any questions you want in the GoToWebinar control panel. In the questions tab, ask any questions, or if you have any comments or anything you agree with or disagree with or any vignettes that you'd like to share, feel free to just chime in and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, Scott, tell us about next steps.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tony. And if anyone's interested in taking a more detailed look at Real Quadrant, how it could apply to your organization, please reach out to us at explore@realstorygroup.com, and I'd be happy to schedule a 15 to 20-minute walkthrough of that tool for you to take a look at. Do want to mention that the next webinar we'll be hosting is next Wednesday at the same time, where we'll be taking a look at the latest research offering we have available on personalization platforms. You'll see that represented in the with the green logo down below there. So certainly hope you can tune in to that. And again, if you have questions or feedback, you can enter that into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. Tony?
Great, thanks, Scott. So Apoorv, I'll toss this one out to you first and then see if there's anything to add. So James is asking, what are some of the common reasons that organizations choose to replace their CDP. So why would an organization replace a CDP? What are your thoughts, Apoorv?
Well, I think the most common reason is that they have matured, right? The organization has matured. So what they selected 3 years back, there wasn't enough. The field itself these are early days, right? So that maturity takes time to build, right? So organizations have matured and now they realize what they actually need, right? So that is one of the reasons. The other reason is that a lot of time organizations implemented what came as a default as part of their CRM or or marketing cloud or whatever, right? So they just implemented that without actually making a lot of effort, right? But over time, so both the two reasons are in some ways similar, but essentially those are two that I can think of right now.
Yeah, that they made a quick decision and found out it wasn't a good fit. And then we see that a lot in emerging marketplaces where there's a lot of excitement over it, and you see something and then you actually deploy it and you realize, hey, this wasn't the right fit for me, either because it's missing some capabilities, or in some cases, we've seen organizations that want to take their CDP beyond the marketing group and suddenly realize that they didn't have non-marketing use cases in there, and that creates an issue. So the next question is, how should we think about Microsoft as a CDP vendor? Apoorv, you want to take a first stab at that, and I'll chime in.
So I think as with other large enterprise software vendors, I would say that if you are heavily invested in Microsoft ecosystem, you have all of their other enterprise applications, it might be an option to consider them. So you might want to consider them in that case. But again, with other large enterprise software vendors, you should select them only purely based on the merits of the CDP itself, and not just because it's part of Microsoft, right? So in general, you will find that that the offerings from all these large enterprise vendors are more integration centric or more IT centric rather than marketer friendly or marketing focus. So with those caveats in mind, think of whether or not you want to consider Microsoft CDP.
Yeah, I mean, the Microsoft CDP is really about it's similar to Salesforce. It's really about stringing together the Microsoft system. Microsoft is interesting because, of course, they have Azure as well, where some CDP vendors use to build capabilities on top of Azure, but as a CDP vendor itself, pretty thin. So Matthew is asking, Apoorv, are master data management solutions generally a better fit for the core data management capabilities? In other words, the things we had in the blue boxes. Are they generally a better fit for the core data management capabilities provided by some CDPs?
I think it's tough to say in absolute sense whether they are better or not. It really depends on what exactly you are going to be using them for. So if your use cases are much more broad or generic, so for example, you have enterprise centric use cases, you have employee centric use cases, and not just marketing centric use cases, right? So if you are doing data management for all of those things, yes, probably MDM and other components of data fabric will probably provide you better capabilities than what a typical CDP would.
Yeah, I think that if you already have an MDM solution, I would encourage you to leverage it, and to then that removes the need to put that pressure on the CDP to provide some of the mastering capabilities that are already built into an MDM, and so you just then bring it into the customer data domain, and it can be very useful. It may not cover all of the data management capabilities you need in a customer data hub, but we do find that it can help accelerate the effort and help narrow the scope of what you need in a CDP if you already have one. If you don't already have one, you don't necessarily need an MDM to complement your CDP. That shouldn't necessarily be the driver to go get one. As Apoorv said, you probably want more broader set of use cases across your enterprise to invest in MDM. Yeah. Great. So with that, we're going to wrap things up. Thanks for sticking a little later with us. We could talk forever on this topic, but instead of talking, we encourage you to take a look at our research, and then we're always open to then, with our subscribers and clients, having private conversations with you. As usual, however, we don't ever work with or advise vendors. So if you're a vendor on the line, I'm sorry, we cannot help you. But if you are an enterprise, an end user enterprise who's looking at this technology, we're here to be helpful to you. So feel free to reach out to Scott, and we can continue this conversation. So for Scott and Apoorv, thanks for joining in today, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.